Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my honour to rise this evening in adjournment proceedings to address a question I asked April 5th, 2017. I'm extremely pleased that this question is still on the order paper because the matter has never been more timely. My question to the Prime Minister then was that since Bill C-38 in 2012, we, that is Canada, has been labouring under a broken environmental assessment process. The day I rose to ask the question was the day that the landmark report from the expert panel, convened by the Honourable Minister for Environment and Climate Change, reported back. And what I put in my question to the Prime Minister then was, and I quote, "The expert panel makes a bold recommendation. Get rid of the National Energy Board's environmental assessment process, have a single authority, and give it quasi-judicial powers." Unquote. I asked the Prime Minister when we could see this recommendation legislated. Well, unfortunately, that question in April, May, and June passed without any answer to when we would see this legislated. And to my horror, right after the House rose for the summer, a discussion paper was put forward from the federal government which combined the 4 different tracks of consultation that had been going on: the expert panel on environmental assessments, the one I've mentioned so far. There was also an expert panel on the National Energy Board, a statutory process under the Standing Committee on Fisheries and Oceans looked at fixing the Fisheries Act, and the Transport Committee looked at the Navigable Waters Protection Act. This cluster of acts had been wrecked under the 2 omnibus budget bills of 2012, C-38 in the spring and C-45 in the fall. The discussion paper put forward by the government in a mere 23 pages makes a hash of all the recommendations and substantive efforts to improve those acts. Let me just refer to what they discuss in environmental assessment, where the expert panel had said sustainability must be central to impact assessments. The word sustainability did not appear, not once, in the discussion paper suggesting how the Liberals plan to legislate to fulfill their campaign promises. Where the expert panel said the National Energy Board and the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission should not do environmental reviews, that there had been a lack of public trust in their work. There should be a single agency with quasi-judicial powers. In the discussion document, we find that for energy projects and nuclear projects and offshore oil and gas, there will be joint assessments. I'm horrified by this, Mr. Speaker, that the National Energy Board will still be engaged, the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission will still be engaged, and worse, the offshore petroleum boards will now get a new mandate to participate in environmental assessments for which they are completely unprepared and incompetent. Lastly, the expert panel also said that we must ensure that there be federal jurisdictional triggers, that whenever a project was on federal land, involved federal money, or was where the federal government was a proponent, in other words, those things that were originally found back in the guideline orders in the 1970s. The first federal environmental assessment was in a guideline order put forward by Cabinet. It was then replaced with the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act, brought forward under the Mulroney government, brought into law under Chrétien. This scheme of laws were substantively and substantially amended over the years to further improve the process, to avoid duplicative processes, to have joint processes, to ensure that there was one project and one review, and so on. All of that trashed by Bill C-38 in 2012. And to my horror now, Mr. Speaker, as I stand before this House, if the discussion document is what is legislated, the chief recommendations of the expert panel are being trashed and ignored, and we will not see the restoration of environmental assessment as it existed in 2006.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of the Status of Women.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to have the opportunity to address the question by the member for Saanich Gulf Islands, a person I have enormous respect for, regarding the review of environmental assessment processes. In 2015, Canadians sent a clear message that they had lost trust in our country's environmental assessment processes, which had been undermined by the significant changes made by the Harper government in 2012. We pledged that if elected, a Liberal government would work to earn back the trust by reforming and modernizing Canada's environmental assessment system. Getting it right is crucial to both our environmental sustainability and our economic prosperity. Mr. Speaker, that's what our government is doing. As a first step to restore that trust, in January 2016, the Minister of Natural Resources and the Minister of Environment and Climate Change announced an interim approach and principles that took immediate effect for all major resources projects under review. These principles affirmed our government's commitment to assess direct upstream greenhouse gas emissions, to seek out and consider the views of the public and affected communities, to affirm that no current project would return to the starting line, to base decisions on science, traditional knowledge, and other relevant evidence, to meaningfully consult Indigenous peoples, and where appropriate, accommodate the impact on their rights. In June of last year, our government took another step to deliver on its commitment to restore confidence in Canada's environmental and regulatory processes with the launch of a comprehensive review in order to rebuild trust in environmental assessment processes, modernize the National Energy Board, and restore loss protections and introduce modern safeguards to the Fisheries Act and the Navigation Protection Act. Now, after more than a year of extensive consultations, our government is putting pen to paper on new legislation, and by early next year, our government will move to enact sweeping changes. Mr. Speaker, with respect to the Canadian Environmental Assessment Agency, this comes as a result of a series of consultation sessions across the country, a report of an expert panel that the member notes in her question, and over 500 formal written submissions and thousands of online comments from Canadians. In June, our government summarized what we had heard in a discussion paper entitled Environmental and Regulatory Reviews, which you can find online. At the core of the proposed new direction is a shift from environmental assessment to impact assessment. This is an important change, Mr. Speaker. It represents a move towards a more holistic approach that considers cultural, social, health, and economic considerations in addition to environmental impacts. Mr. Speaker, we have seen what has not worked in the past. It's clear that open and inclusive processes build better outcomes, early engagement can enhance project planning, and a predictable, timely process is key. Indigenous peoples have also been engaged on an ongoing basis since the review was launched, and we will continue to work with Indigenous peoples as we consider options for legislative, regulatory, and policy changes. Mr. Speaker, just in closing, Canadians want to know that they can trust their environmental processes, and that is exactly what our government is working to deliver. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Well, I thank my friend, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, for the status of women. But I have to say, when he says to us that the discussion document released in late June, quote, summarized what we have heard, I think there's something wrong with the Liberals' hearing. Because loud and clear, the expert panel said the National Energy Board should have nothing to do with environmental assessments. So too did the expert panel on the National Energy Board. The Environmental Assessment Expert Panel, chaired by our former Commissioner for Environment and Sustainable Development, was very clear that sustainability should be central. It was very clear that we need to go beyond a project list that limits when environmental reviews take place to look at federal jurisdiction overall. None of these recommendations, broadly supported by tens of thousands of Canadians, made it into the discussion document. So please, scrap the discussion document. Go back to the expert panel.